Okay, this is the second video in the prehistoric part of Medicine Through Time, and I started that by talking to a PowerPoint which you couldn't see. Yes, I've had to watch myself on video. It was a real eye-opener. Anyway, the point is, it occurred to me there are a couple of side notes, so I guess this is a video entitled Side Notes, in which I was talking about Stonehenge and I was talking about prehistoric society, and it occurred to me I didn't go into detail about how we knew these things. Especially the part about how we knew that they weren't exactly warlike. So, for example, there's a work by Mike Pitts called Henge World, well worth a read, and there's the most recent research into Stonehenge itself. And in it, they point out that there's plenty of evidence that actually there was a bit of a fight going on. There's an actual war, possibly organised between two different tribes, being fought in the area where Stonehenge was erected. The Preseli Bluestones were part of an original henge that was many miles distant from where they currently reside. And the Sarsens that are from the local area, the huge white stones that we're all familiar with, they were part of a henge, again, a couple of, maybe 30 miles distant from their current location. So they had these two henges, and there's evidence that there was fighting all around the south of England, implying that these two tribes had very large territories and that they had reasonably large populations. Furthermore, the evidence suggests that these two tribes didn't necessarily hail from that area. They weren't fighting over land so much as they were fighting on a border. So people came from all over what we now know as Europe. And fought there. So when I said they were peaceful, there's evidence of a lot of warfare. The thing is, this is unusual. Mostly when we find evidence of bodies like the Isbister tomb, for example, or we find evidence of burials, or we find evidence of dead people, they've died from natural causes, they've died from old age, they've died from osteoporosis, they've died from arthritis, they've died from extreme exertion, but not from war. There is one other battle in Germany, I think, but I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I think that was Bronze Age, though, rather than prehistoric. Which brings me on to my next point. Prehistory refers to a very specific time, and that is anything before the invention of writing. So prehistory changes into history at different points, depending on which nation, which people, which civilization, which area of the world you're looking at. So, for example, the Harappan people, hold on, teacher, can't use anything without a board. So Harappan, H-A-R-R-A-P-P, Harappan. I think they're named after a valley in maybe the Indus Valley in India. And the Harappan people had these large cityscapes. We don't know why they were abandoned, and there's little evidence that tells us who lived there. But we do know that they could have had up to 150,000 people per site. So clearly something's going on there, and they had the written language. Now we think that they date from around about 5000 BC. If that's the case, writing was developed there before writing was developed in ancient Egypt. Now, for the purposes of Medicine Through Time, we always assume that writing was developed in Egypt, ancient Egypt, and we talk about ancient Egypt as being the first major civilization. But there's Sumeria, there's the Indus Valleys in the Euphrates and co. So the Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent areas, and we don't really talk about those very much. But I wanted to go back further than that, because the building of Stonehenge, of course, I always see Stonehenge as a bit of a... Stonehenge on its own doesn't mean anything, it's part of a much wider landscape. So Stonehenge is clearly a monument to the end, the afterlife, if you will, because the gaps between the trilithons are where wood would have been, but it's rotted away. So the stones are all about the gaps, rather than the stones themselves. It's part of a larger landscape where you've got Durrington Wells, which is new wood and had to be rebuilt every time, from what we can gather. And we've got the other one, that's name escapes me, but there's various henges around there. There's also Avebury, and Avebury's fascinating because the ditch at Avebury is massive and very deep, and part of it was dug by what Mike Pitts calls the Mavericks, a group of people that dug differently to the other groups of people, the other teams that were digging, implying that these are different family groups or different tribal groups or hunting groups coming together for a communal act. In this case, digging a ditch. And what they dug the ditch with was deer antler. And the interesting thing about deer antler is you can work out its age. All of the deer antler used was many hundreds of years older than the ditch they were used to dig, implying these have been carted around by these people for quite some time and held some kind of significance. Furthermore, that the ditch appears inside the sort of raised earth bank implies this isn't a defensive structure. These are built for something else, hence the ceremonial idea. Where did those antlers come from? Well, they come from another period. So the period we're talking about with Stonehenge, the period I was talking about as prehistory, we tend to refer to as the Neolithic. There's another period called the Mesolithic. And the Mesolithic is, to my mind, really interesting. We know very little about it, and I know even less. But during the Mesolithic, there was an area of land just what we now call the North Sea. And out there on the North Sea, there was something called Doggerland. We have Dogger Bank now. Doggerland was finally submerged by a series of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and mudslides in Norway. But before that point, we know humans lived there. So that whole area that we now know as the North Sea was quite fertile. We found evidence of farming. We found evidence of settlements on the seabed. We know that Mesolithic humans lived there in large numbers. Well, large numbers for the time. And that they travelled large distances. At that point, what was the site of what would become the site of Stonehenge is sort of several grooves that would have been visible above the soil from the limestone underneath, which would have been quite interesting and probably something of interest and importance to those people that lived at that time, which probably explains the sighting of Stonehenge later on. They also, by the way, line up with various equinoxes and where the sun rises and sets. Just by dint of geography. And it's a natural phenomenon. So when these two warring tribes came together, it appears they brought the Sarsens and the bluestones, the Preseli bluestones from Wales, and they brought them together and put them in a single henge, which they then regularly moved around, probably to symbolise the end of that conflict. Which probably explains why there's so many people visit this as a major ceremonial centre and eat so much food. We also know, for example, that the smaller henges, like Longmeggen and Daughters in Cumbria and others in Scotland, came about after Stonehenge and were probably an attempt by local chieftains, local powerful people, to localise the idea of whatever was going on at Stonehenge and to take away from the travel time. There is one oddity about all of this, and that's the Society on the Orkneys, where we get the Isbister tomb, and Skara Brae, which is an old Neolithic encampment or village that was blown under a sand dune during a single storm, so it's remarkably well preserved. There are no human remains, so implying that people got out, they knew it was coming. I can't really think of anything else to say about that, but I did want to like kind of a side note on prehistory, because I'm not doing medicine through time, you're not doing an exam. I thought that was interesting. If you're interested, Mike Pitt's Henge World, that's a good place to start. And Stonehenge, the New Evidence, which was released in 2012. These are the books I'd recommend if you're interested in that sort of thing. And I just thought, as I say, I'd do a side note while looking increasingly like a 1960s Bond villain. It's the turtleneck. Anyway, you get the idea. Other than that, thank you very much for watching. I hope this was of interest. It's a bit different because I don't have an overhead. I do feel kind of naked without one. And have a good day. Stay at home. And I shall no doubt be in touch soon. Thank you very much.